Hello, and welcome to AuthorFest. I'm Jonathan Karp, the president and CEO of Simon Schuster. And we created this event as a way of bringing authors directly to book festival goers across America to answer questions and engage in conversations with readers about their work. Tonight, I am delighted to welcome two of Simon & Schuster's most beloved and acclaimed authors, John Irving and Jason Reynolds. John Irving is one of the greatest writers in the world. Now, I know that's a strong statement to make, but you don't have to take my word for it. Here's how an international array of book reviewers have described his work. From Time magazine, it is impossible to imagine the American or international literary landscape without John Irving. He is as close to one gets to a contemporary Dickens in the scope of his celebrity and the level of his achievement. From Time Out in London, wickedly knowing, mischievously postmodern, and magical realist. From the Globe and Mail in Toronto, Irving offers a faith in patient storytelling and the conviction that narrative hunger is a part of our essence. From Le Monde in Paris, more than 40 years after Karp, thanks to his devastating irony, quiet provocation, comic obsessions, priapic debauchery, sex and neuroses on all levels, John Irving remains unrivaled. From De Groene Amsterdammer in Amsterdam, Irving's sometimes burlesque but always moving novels are first a plea for mercy and tolerance. And from Der Spiegel in Hamburg, when reading an Irving novel, the outside world becomes just a distraction and real life happens inside the reader's head. Over the summer, I received a subpoena in the US District Court to testify there at a trial about the book publishing business. And during cross-examination, the Department of Justice's lawyer asked me if John Irving is my favorite author. And under oath and without any kind of hesitation, I affirmed that John is indeed my favorite writer. He is the author whose books made me love fiction. 33 years ago, I applied for a job at Random House as an editorial assistant, in part because Random House was John Irving's first publisher. I also testified in US District Court that his new novel, The Last Chairlift, is among the very best of the 15 novels that he's written. And I can assure you that my testimony is true because I do not want to be convicted of perjury. Now, Jason Reynolds is also one of the greatest writers in the world, specifically the world of children's literature, to which he has contributed 17 award-winning and best-selling books, including the #1 bestseller, Long Way Down, Look Both Ways, Ain't Burned All That Bright, and his latest bestseller, Stunt Boy, In the Meantime. His works have been called lyrical masterpieces, pitch perfect, pure gold, and breathtaking. He's the recipient of a Newbery Honor, a Prince Honor, an NAACP Image Award, the Schneider Family Book Award, the Kirkus Prize, the Mystery of Writers America Edgar Award, and multiple Coretta Scott King honors. According to a recent profile in The New Yorker, Jason's ability to connect his own experiences with those of the young people he writes for and to address his readers with patience and respect has made him a superstar in the world of children's lit. The Library of Congress has named him the National Ambassador for Young People's Literature for 3 terms, which is unprecedented. And this role has enabled him to use his extraordinary charisma and love of poetry and storytelling to reach audiences of children who might not otherwise be interested in books. He's been called an exceptionally perceptive chronicler of what it means to be a Black teen in America. Jason has said, "I write to Black children, but I write for all children." I can testify personally to the universality of Jason's appeal. When I was preparing for this event one night, my 9-year-old son saw a copy of Stunt Boy In the Meantime on my table, and he asked me if he could read it. And he was immediately captivated by it. And when I asked my son why, he said, and this is a direct quote, "Because it's funny and I like Stunt Boy, even though he's not really a superhero." My colleagues in the children's division of Simon & Schuster are incredibly proud and grateful to be the publisher of Jason's work, because we all know that his books are helping to establish a new generation of readers. John and Jason, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And Jason, I will start with you. You both write about the ways in which young identities are formed and forged. So why does this subject appeal to you?
It's such an interesting. First, let me just say thank you for having me, Mr. Irving. I guess I don't really know what to say to you except for thanks for all of your work, and I've stolen enough from you throughout the years, so I feel like this is at least the least I could do is let you know how grateful I am. Um, I think for me, I think that there is something really interesting about that age, about sort of writing about the identities of young people, because their identities are changing at a faster pace, and there's something really fresh about their lives because they're experiencing things for the first time. And I think once you get past a certain point, sure, there are still moments in my life that feel brand new, but there are less of them, right? And life sort of becomes a bit rote in certain ways. But I remember being 10 and 11 and 12, and every day or every other day there was a new experience, a new challenge, a new line to push. And I think there's something about that makes the job of writing more interesting for me. And I think that's why and also I'm stuck in that space emotionally and mentally. I'm always going to be between the ages of 10 and 16. I think we all are, by the way. I think that sort of our sort of cheeky natures, if we're allowed to let them out, are really sort of, crystallize in that particular juncture of our lives. And I'm grateful for that. I want to hold on to that part of myself. And so I continue to write about it as a way to sort of pay homage to it and also hold on to it for as long as possible.
Thanks. John?
Well, childhood and adolescence, I think, are so formative for all of us. But it was an especially formative time for me. It coincidentally, I read the two writers who most influenced me as a writer and made me want to be a writer when I was only a teenager. And I began trying to write fiction myself at the same time I started wrestling. And these were the only things in my life up to that point that I had been somewhat successful at, and formative in this way too. But why this subject appeals to me so much as a writer, I think, is that it's both comic and tragic. Mm-hmm. But what happens to you in childhood, and especially in early adolescence, it's the comedy and tragedy together that has always appealed to me. In writing too, in what I read and in what I hope to do as a writer, as Dickens intended, to move a reader to laughter or to tears, or both, to affect a reader emotionally more than to persuade a reader intellectually. All of that came to me when I was a young teenager. I'm just recording it.
So, John, in One Person, your novel In One Person, you wrote, "We are formed by what we desire." So, Jason, I'm just wondering, what are some of the desires you most enjoy writing about?
I think such a good question. I think most of the desires that I really love to write about these days usually are just the desire to be acknowledged. It's very simple for me. I think it's just the desire to be seen, the desire to be heard. I mean, that age range, like as Mr. Irving was saying, right? You have the comic element of it, but you also have the tragic element of it. And I think in the nexus of those two things often has to do with the sort of wrestling with the necessity and the desire to be seen and heard. right? And I think that's what makes it so funny and so tragic sometimes. Because if you talk to any kid in America, or so many kids in America, they'll tell you that they feel like everybody is paying attention to them, and yet nobody can see them. They'll tell you that like they don't feel like they have any power, and yet their egos are saying they have all the power. And I think it's that push pull that is always the thing when it comes to desire, right? I think they just desire to be seen and heard and acknowledged, you know.
John, how about you?
Well, sexual desire, especially as a young person, is often so painful and embarrassing simultaneously that you'll never forget that part of it, the painful part and the embarrassing part. But once again, the combination of trauma and comedy feels natural to me. It feels the way it is. I've often said about my writing that I want it to be funny until it very much isn't, or isn't anymore. I want to set up what isn't funny by being funny, which may sound like a contradiction, but it was what attracted me to writing as a reader. That was what first drew me as a reader, the possibility of the overlap of trauma and comedy, the pain and the embarrassment. And the embarrassment is only funny long enough after the fact.
Right. John, do you remember which book you read early that had both that kind of comedy or tragedy?
Well, certainly that was Dickens. Certainly that was Dickens, who could be funny one minute, but you didn't trust where he was going with it. You knew he could turn that around, and so often would turn that around. That wonderful moment in David Copperfield when David's old tormentor from school, the boy who persecutes him so relentlessly, Steerforth, has also gone on to hurt other people. But when his body washes ashore on the beach, Copperfield sees the way he's lying with his head on his arm and says, the way he used to lie on his desk at school, which suddenly, so far into this long novel, even longer, I must say, than The Last Chairlift, so far into this long novel, you realize, oh, I see, not only was Steerforth his tormentor, but Copperfield loved him. He also worshipped him. And that juxtaposition just stayed with me.
Jason, how about you? Galvanizing book?
Oh, oof. There's so many. I mean, Black Boy by Richard Wright is up there. Sula is up there, right? I mean, you take a character like Sula, you root for, in ways that are like you root for it, though you're rooting for it because you wish you had the courage to be Sula, right? But at the same time, you also know that Sula is doing some pretty foul things to people that she claims to love, right? And I think in that there is something funny about sort of her brashness, and also something tragic about that same thing, right? Both of those, like it sort of shares that weight in that way. So I would have to put, Toni Morrison up there as being a master at that, for sure.
Well, that actually makes me want to ask you both a question about the likability of the characters that you create. John, years ago, and I don't even remember where I read it, but and this might be an apocryphal story, I might have gotten it wrong. You were quoted saying that after your first 3 novels, you decided that you only wanted to write about people who you really liked, or who you thought the reader could feel compassion for. So the question I have for both of you is, how do you deal with unlikable characters, and how do you get across the idea that characters who you want to like might do things that are unappealing?
To me, it's essential. If you're going to love a character and you want your reader to love that character, that the character in some way also should be flawed. If the character is flawed, that's what makes that character human. The danger of Dr. Larch, the obstetrician gynecologist doctor at the orphanage in St. Cloud's, in the Cider House Rules, the danger in him was to make him too much of a hero. He is my hero, risking performing an abortion at a time when he could go to jail or face a fine or both, to help those women. But there had to be something wrong with him. He had to be affected by everything he did. And so to me, the ether addiction was natural. There had to be something wrong from the sheer pressure of his existence. And certainly in the Last Chairlift, it's easy to see that the same things we love Adam's mother for, or I hope the reader will love her for, her obstinate independence, also betrays an inclination to go too far. She will take a step too far, and we learn that about her. We learn that she will overstep the rules to a point that sometimes we think, oh no, that's more than independent. That's just plain bad. That's just plain wrong. But without that danger in her, that is provided by her strength, I don't think she's human enough.
You know, Jason, I came across an interview you gave, and you talked about your experience working as a caseworker at a mental health clinic, and you told a reporter, and this is what you said: you never really know how human you are until you sit in the driver's seat and there's a man who has committed murder sitting in the passenger seat and you like him a lot. Mm-hmm. The ability to humanize the vilified was a gift to me. Do you feel like you have to do that in your writing?
I feel like I have to do that in my life, and therefore in my writing. I mean, look, I think that the idea around likable characters is an interesting one, something that we talk about often. Like, is the unlikable character valuable for a novel? The truth is that I don't have to like the characters, but I do have to love them, right? But I do have to, just like all the other people in my life. I have siblings whom I sometimes don't like because they do things that are human, and their humanity presses upon my own and makes things inconvenient for me, right? But I love them anyway. And these moments, these human moments, are what make our lives interesting, and what make our lives worth it, and what makes our relationships what they are, right? Because I have to make conscientious choices to love this person consistently despite themselves, right? So for me, when I think about my characters, I just like Mr. Irving, right? I just want to write flawed people because people tend to be flawed. It's to not write this way, to me, would just be poor writing. It would just it just be poor writing. You know, it's one of these questions that I'm always kind of like, I mean, like, people are people. If they're not interesting, don't put them in the book. They shouldn't be there if they're not interesting, if they're not serving the story. And the only way that they could actually be serving the story is if they're interesting. And the only way that they could be interesting is if they're flawed, because that's how human beings are. So do I have to like them all? Do I have to love them all? Yes.
All right, but there's more to it. What about the idea that you want the reader to care? I mean, it's one thing to either like or love a character. It's another thing for the reader to actually care about the character. Do you feel like that's something within your control, Jason, to make a reader care about a character?
I don't know if it's in my control, but it's definitely what I attempt. It's definitely what I attempt. My theory around writing is actually very simple when it comes to character development. I really believe that our novels or the work that we do can really model our everyday experiences. And what I mean by that, and I mean that in sort of a macro level. And what I mean by that is, in real life, there are people in my life that I spend time with, um, whom I'm connected to, who I find interesting and intriguing. And because I find them interesting and intriguing, we don't actually have to do much of anything for us to have a good time. Right. And so I try to develop characters that are that rich and that are that much depth, so that just in case this is a story with not a sort of bang and crash plot line, a reader will still want to spend some time with these human beings on the page. My theory is that if you write characters, you're actually writing caricatures of humans. So I try to write humans, right? I try to write humans, and in hopes that the reader will care, will recognize the humanity in these people.
That's great. I mean, John, is there any kind of a craft in terms of making readers care about characters? Do you think that there's something that as a writer you can do to make them care?
I think you want your reader to be afraid for the characters you want them to love, as most of us are naturally afraid of losing the people we love. I say that as a committed worst case scenario writer. At the same time, I hope I've made characters that you're emotionally invested in. I set up the signals that they're vulnerable, that something's going to happen. It sounds perverse. Maybe it is perverse that I conspire to make bad things happen to good people. They do. That's true, but it's also what we most fear. I was giving a reading one time, and an audience. There was an audience Q&A, and when someone in the audience realized that I'd come with my then 14, almost 15-year-old son, Colin, who had read The World According to Karp when he was only 12 or 13. I was worried about that. It seemed kind of young at the time. And the young woman in the audience knew who Colin was. She'd seen him come in with me, and she put him on the spot. She said, "Is your dad Karp? Is that his life? Is that how you've grown up or how you live?" And I thought, oh, poor Colin. What's he going to do? Well, I should have trusted him. We talked about the novel when he read it in manuscript. But he said, no, that Karp isn't my dad. That isn't our life. He doesn't write about us or him. He writes about what he's afraid of.
Yes.
Something happening to us.
Well, actually, that was one of the questions that was sent in by one of the Kentucky Book Festival. Actually, wanted to know, what are you afraid to write, and will you write it one day? And Jason, that was a question for you. So, what are you afraid of, and will you write it one day?
I don't know. It's a good question. I'm not like, I'm working on this novel for adults. And there are some things that I don't want to talk about because I don't want to spoil it all. And, but there are some things in that novel that that made me a bit reticent. There's some things in that. I don't want to really go into. I apologize to the person who asked that question, but there are some things that have given me some pause in that novel. But I've decided to press forward and write it anyway, and let the chips fall where they may, because it's honest for the novel, right? It's honest to the work that I'm doing in this particular story. But other than that, I always attack the things that scare me. How do you write about sort of gun violence in a way that feels fair to the person with the gun, which is what Long Way Down is, right? How do you write sort of family dynamics that are quote unquote broken, that seem fair to the people who are in that family, right? Which is difficult. So it's not necessarily it's not that the subject matter scares me. It's just, do I have the chops to pull it off? That always kind of gives me a little pause, right? To do it with do I have a deft enough hand? Is what kind of like, can I do this? Am I John Irving, right? Like, can I swing this? But I go for it, and it works itself out. Shout out to the editors. You know what I mean?
Well, Jason, I read Long Way Down, and you can definitely swing this. That is a great book. And actually, there are ghosts in that book. And since John's novel, The Last Chairlift, is also a ghost story, I would like to ask both of you, and John, I'll start with you. What is the deal? Do you believe in ghosts, and why are you compelled to write about them? Because you have written about them before, and they're back.
Yeah, they're back. They're back, more of them than there used to be. They first showed up, or a ghost first showed up in A Prayer for Owen Meany, a slight, not even a sighting, more of a presence. That ghost was. There was definitely a ghost in one person. Speaking as a non-religious person, I have to say that ghosts are, as far as I can credibly imagine, the spiritual world. I don't deny the presence of ghosts. I don't deny. I have many rational and reasonable friends who you wouldn't instantly judge as that's the sort of person who sees ghosts in some sort of dismissive way. I've personally not had a ghost sighting, and I'm very disappointed that I haven't. But I know people very well who have had those experiences, and I don't doubt that I don't doubt that they're real. And so that is a credible part of the spiritual world to me. As one of my characters in The Last Chairlift says, if you love someone, ghosts or no ghosts, you're gonna go on seeing them. They're not gonna go away. Well, everyone who's lost someone knows that they don't go away. They don't go away.
Jason?
Sure. I mean, there are, yes, on many levels. I think, and culturally, there's belief in ancestors and sort of ancestral presence that I believe in. But also, I just really think that everything sticks on you, right? I think that there are ghosts that exist in sort of the ideas of a spirit, of a sort of spiritual nature. But I also think that, like, my mother haunts me every day, and she lives around the corner. Right, but but I can hear her in my ear every day. Everything I do, I can feel her right on my shoulder saying, how I taught you to do these things, or that this ain't the way, and you're about to step in it, and better, right? Like, or teachers, the ones who have been good to me and the ones who have not been good to me, haunt me, and they're alive, right? But they're always there, and I think that's sort of one of the most interesting parts of humanity, is that the human experience, is that, like, so many of our interactions stick. They just kind of stick on you. This moment will stick on me. There's something that's going to be said tonight that will stick on me and that will haunt me moving forward. I don't think haunting always has to be a spooky thing. I think it can be fortifying. I think we can call it conscience, and things of that nature. So.
Well, I have to tell you, when you talk about hearing your mother's voice, I edited Mario Puzo, and he told me that whenever Don Corleone spoke, whenever the Godfather spoke, he was hearing the voice of his mother, which I always found rather amazing, because I never thought of, Mario Puzo's mother when I read The Godfather. Anyway, so you've both been quite prolific. Jason, you are the author or co-author of 19 books. John, as I mentioned, The Last Chairlift is novel number 15 for you. And so what I'm wondering is, How often do you want your work to have a moral or political objective? Do you want it every time out? Jason, why don't you go first on this one?
Never. That's never my objective. That's the way my books get talked about, right? But I don't, that's not on me, right? Once the book is out in the world, it's none of my business. Like that's the, you know what I mean? But in terms of sort of my intention, I never come to the table with any sort of moral or any of that. I live a political life because I live here and I'm a Black man in America moving around, and that is what it is, right? But I'm never sort of intentionally trying to be heavy-handed or didactic about really anything. My whole thing is just to bear witness to the lives of the people that I'm writing about and the people who might just be reading these books. I'm not a teacher. I'm not even a parent. I'm not trying to teach any lessons. They have other people in their lives for that. If they get lessons from it, that's okay, right? That's what art does. That's what art does. But I'm just trying to tell a good story and bear witness to the lives of these kids. It's very simple for me in that way.
John, how about you?
Well, by my count, I'm guessing slightly more than half of my novels have a social conscience. What I mean by that is that they do take a polemical or a political side of something. They pick a side. But it's, even in the case of slightly more than half, even in the case of those novels that do take a polemical or political position, it wasn't the primary reason I thought of the story. The trajectory of the story itself and the characters came first. Mm-hmm. You have to be in the story and writing it before it occurs to you who it's really for. It's not easy, or it's not hard. It is easy for me to say, in the case of The Last Chairlift, where my social conscience lies, or where it comes from. I wanted to create a trans woman hero for my trans daughter Eva, because Eva is my hero. But that consciousness didn't occur until I started the storyline for which had pre-existed the moment that I began. Then it quickly, from the first appearance of that trans character, I thought, well, this is your hero. This is what you're in it for. But it's you realize that on the way. Mm-hmm. I completely agree with Jason that you don't make that choice arbitrarily before you start. That doesn't happen. Not to me.
So you've both written about fathers. You've written about absent fathers, present fathers, and I'm wondering how your relationships with your father influenced your fiction. Jason, you want to go first on that one?
That's a good question. It is. I gotta say, I never get to talk about my old man because I love my mother so much. She always sort of shows up in my conversations. But this is such a good question, and I'm so grateful that you asked. So my father's no longer alive, but he was. If there was anybody to tell a story or to write a story about, it's this guy. He was one of these. He was the most interesting person I've ever known. And I think he influences me in terms of my storytelling. One, just sheer, he had moxie like nobody's business. He was bold and he was charismatic, and he was kind and he was sensitive. He was the kind of man that you would assume you didn't want to bump into in any dark street, but he was all about like kissing his boys and like. Right, he was very affectionate and very sensitive, but also covered in tattoos from head to toe, and really not about the games. Simon, he had all the things, right? He was like motorcycles, and also, hugging and kissing his children and making sure that he was being that part of himself as well. And so if anything, he taught me balance. He taught me like what you see in the books. He taught me fun and humor, which you see in the books. And he taught me sensitivity, specifically as it pertains to writing boys, which I write so much of, but like figuring out how to write boys who are whole, because my father was a whole, one of the few men in my life that I can look at and say, there's a whole person, good, bad, and everything else, right? But there was a whole person. And so I appreciate that, man. Shout out to the old man. I miss him very, very much.
Thank you for sharing that. John, how about you? I know that you've talked a little bit about this in the past and written about it, but I still think it's worth talking about.
I should just also say that yes, Jason and I have both written about fathers, but we've also both written about coaches, and we've also both acknowledged those teammates we had who were much better than we ever were. That's another familiar theme. In my case, the missing father makes a repeated appearance. The missing biological father is a part of my life. The wondering about him, the wishing I knew him, the wanting to know more about someone I had no memory of. But I can't separate fathers in my writing or in my life from the persistent presence in my writing of all these beloved stepfathers. I've had wonderful stepfathers in more than one novel, and I had the greatest good fortune of my life when I was a child was to have a wonderful stepfather. When he adopted me, and I had suddenly his name, the name of someone who I sort of instantly loved and who was instantly not like a good father, but a good father and the only father I know. I'm so happy he's still alive, my stepfather, because I keep writing these good stepfathers for him. That's something I'm both conscious of, but it's also unconscious of in the way obsessions are. Mm-hmm. You don't get to choose.
Well, there is an extraordinary stepfather in The Last Chairlift, and I won't say anything more except that. And John, in the interest of equal time, what about the ways in which your mother influenced your fiction? And then Jason, I'd like you to answer the same question, although I know you've talked about that before.
Well, my mother was a major influence on me, and a major character in the lives of most people who knew her. In terms of how formative she was, there's something I overheard her saying to someone else in my family. I don't even remember the context now. I don't even remember to whom this was said. I was just there in the room or in the next room and overheard it. But I remember the context at the time. She was a nurse's aide who worked in a New Hampshire county family counseling service, which largely meant in the days before Roe versus Wade, that she did a lot of talking to young, not just unmarried, but underage girls who were pregnant and who were facing the prospect of mandatory childbirth or a illegal, unsafe abortion. And now at this time, I'm a young, unknown writer with 2 young children. And I have a younger brother, sister, boy-girl twins, who are both gay. And that's the background to hearing my mother say, if they think, she meant men in power, if they think they can treat us, meaning women, like we're minorities, think how much worse they're going to treat gay men and gay women. Well, I've given that remark to more than one of my fictional mothers, including in The Last Chairlift. To say it made an impact on me is well, it sure did.
Thank you. Jason, how about you? What would you like to say?
You know, one of the most powerful things that my mother ever did for me was give the ability to give me the permission to talk back. As a child, I was allowed to, and people have heard this story, but I was allowed to talk back, which is a no-no for many of our families. But in my household, you know, if my mother said something or if she was chastising me, I was allowed to respectfully articulate the way I was feeling. And even if it was the way I was feeling about what she'd said or the way she'd said it. And the reason why is because she wanted me to know as a very young person that my feelings and opinions and my voice mattered, regardless of my age. What that looks like years later is a person who understands that my voice has a place in the world simply because it belongs to me. That I need not ever muzzle myself. And because I know not to muzzle myself, I know not to muzzle any other child, because every child has a right to say the things that they need to say, because they're human beings. They're not half-formed things. And my mom was very much about that, right? The other thing that she gave me in terms of helping with my work is like she modeled discipline for me. She modeled persistence and consistency. This is a woman born in 45 in the rural South, moves to Washington, D.C., takes a job at 15 in an insurance company in the mailroom. And then because of the March on Washington, which she attends, she realizes that she will not stay in this mailroom, works her way all the way up the ladder until she gets to sort of the executive office, the first Black person, the first Black woman, the first woman to have this position, stays there for 40 years, retires. They say that she only took 2 days off, and those were the days she was giving birth to me. That's the myth. I don't know if it's true, but that's what everybody says. She was giving birth to me, has cancer, beats cancer twice, then takes a job as a special ed teacher where she works for another 15 years before retiring again in 2020. I don't have any excuse. I know what it is to do the job. I know what it is to sort of hunker down and make the things happen. And I give her all the credit for that. She modeled that very, very well for us.
That's terrific. We're down to like our last 12 minutes or so. So a lot of questions have been coming in. I wish I could ask all of them. The Bookmarks Festival, somebody from the Bookmarks Festival wants to know, how has your writing process changed over the years? How has your writing and your process changed over the years? You can answer, you can either talk about how your writing has changed or how your process has changed. John, you want to take that first?
Well, the biggest change in my life as a writer was writing my first 4 books with a full-time job. I was an English teacher and a wrestling coach, and presumed I always would be. I could do those things. I knew how to do those things. I liked working with young people who wanted to find things they loved to read, wanted to try writing. I loved working with young wrestlers. I could be of use, I thought. But I resented how little time I had to write. For the writing of those first 4 novels, maybe I could write for 2 hours a day, and not every day. I had 2 young children. I had a full-time job. It was the 4th novel, The World According to Karp, that was my first bestseller. And I think it helped me later as a writer, that it didn't happen for me overnight. And I never thought it would. When my editor said, this is going to be different, the world according to Karp it's going to find an audience, I didn't believe him. I thought it was wishful thinking, you know. I didn't believe it. But the change in my life to being able to write 7 days a week, 8 hours a day was enormous. And it was such a big change that it took me the writing of one book, The Hotel New Hampshire, before I could fill the time, before I knew how to do it. I was really disappointed with myself. It wasn't until the 6th book, The Cider House Rules, that I could go all day, every day. It took a while to get there. And well, when you can do something every day, all day, you should get better at it. You better get better at it than you were when you only had 2 hours a day, right?
Jason, how do you think about it?
No, I similarly, I worked in a clothing store and was able to quit that job at 30, and then was able sort of to devote my time to the thing I love most. What has changed, I think, I'm 39 now. I still feel very young. So like there's a lot of books that are published, but I still feel like I'm finding my voice, you know? I mean, I look at Mr. Irving and what he's accomplished over the course of a lifetime, and I'm like, I just got work to do, and I have, prayerfully some time to continue to develop, and to get better and to push myself, to try new things, to, like I'm just so like I'm in flux at the moment, right? So like you're asking a question and I'm like, well, I'm kind of in the middle of whatever the change is. I'm sort of experiencing it at this very moment. I feel like whatever's coming for the next decade for me when it comes to my work is going to be different. And I'm excited about that, and I'm looking forward to leaning into whatever that might look like. I will tell you, in terms of process, I can no longer write on the computer, solely on the computer. I can't do it anymore. I have to use a pen and pad, which is a trip for me, just because my generation doesn't do that, right? But it works, and it's more. It feels. If there's a freedom to it, there's a flow to it. My brain is doing different things when my hand is working in that way. I don't know if it's the ink. I don't know what it is, but it's a very different feeling, and it works much better to put my hand to do this than to do this. And I'm enjoying that, and I'm leaning into that. And I've got all the notebooks and all the pens and all the things. Right, I'm in that phase, and I love that. And I can see myself eventually getting to a place where it'll just all be in the notebooks, and I have to have them all transcribed. I don't know why, but I'm not trying to fight it. It's what's working at this moment, and I'm going to continue to do that. So for the past 3 or 4 books, it's all been in pen and pad.
Well, I think you have a soulmate here. John, do you want to talk about your process? I know that you're similar.
Well, I just wanted to say to Jason that one thing we both like to do, and boy, do you, Jason, do it well. We both like using repetition constantly. And I love it, and I love how it happens in Ain't Burned All That Bright. That nobody repeatedly changes the damn TV channel, and how the news never manages to change the story. I couldn't get enough of that, and each time it happened again, boy, did it hit home.
Thank you.
And John, you also write in longhand, right?
I do. My mom did me a favor for my school years by teaching me how to type when I was only 13, 14 years old. It was a big help to me in school, where I was a slow student, that I could at least type all of my papers. I'm pretty fast, hardly flawless, but I'm pretty fast on the keyboard. As I discovered, too fast.
Mm.
I wouldn't dream of writing a letter in longhand. I love my laptop. I love a keyboard. But when I write fiction or when I write a screenplay, I always write first drafts by hand. And I used to type up the second or third draft before I could afford a typist. And then when I could afford a full-time assistant, it made my handwriting even better because I was consciously writing even slower to be sure she could transcribe me. And that helps too. The slowing down means it feels more like drawing. I love that. I love that.
That's interesting.
All right. Well, we have a question from the Bay Area Book Festival. They would like to know what your favorite word is. So, Jason, you want to take that one?
Nuance. I just love it. I love the way it feels. Mouthfeel. I just love the mouthfeel of it. Nuance.
John?
Maybe because I'm so familiar with it that if I didn't love and revere the word, I might get tired of it. But I have to say, rewriting. Rewriting hits me at home because I do a lot of it. I probably spend as much time rewriting as I do writing a first draft, and I love that part of the process too. I just the word has it stuck for me. It does it for me.
All right. The Black Readers Conference wants to know if you could only recommend one of your books. Which of your books would you recommend, Jason? I know the humility is important, but go for it.
I think it'd probably be Look Both Ways. I mean, because you get a sampling of many styles. I mean, that book has 10 different stories, 10 different styles, bunches, like lots of characters, I don't know. I think that book is a good, if this is the first sort of foray into my work, I think it's a good sort of sampling of a lot of different styles and worlds. I think that would be my choice. I think is Look Both Ways.
Okay, thank you, John.
Well, I just got to say that I kind of thought Jason was going to say All American Boys because of how because of what an impression it made on me when Rashad says he felt like the reverse of Clark Kent running into the phone booth to become Superman. Rather, he feels like Superman running into the booth and becoming, with some luck, a much cooler. Yeah, that has to affect anyone who ever wanted to be a writer, because we've all felt like the uncool Clark Kent, at least. At least I know I have. In my case, this is possibly perverse, but I like the novels of mine where I had to learn the most. That is, the most outside of my own experience. The medical, obstetrical, gynecological detail and language I had to learn for the Cider House Rules. It was hard for me, but I liked learning it. The tattoo world in Until I Find You, because the learning it was learning to be in someone else's shoes. Isn't that what fiction does best? Is putting the reader in the position of what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. Well, as a writer, I liked having to learn what it was like to be in someone else's shoes. The relationship between the homicide cop and the prostitutes in the red light district in A Widow for 1 year. I had to learn a whole new language. And the time I spent in Amsterdam, I loved it because I was learning something. So it's hard for me to discern between those three books, Cider House, Until I Find You, A Widow, but they left the biggest impression on what I had to learn for the first time.
Well, if anybody's wondering why the two of you are paired up tonight, I mean, we actually saw an interview, Jason, that you gave to the New York Times Book Review, where you said that A Prayer for Owen Meany was on your night table. So we figured, well, why not put them together? So yeah, I guess you read that one.
I have to say really quickly that book was given to me by the co-author of All American Boys, Brendan Kiley, who is your biggest fan, Mr. Irving, and who was the one who was like, listen, this is for you. You have to read this. I was late to your work. And then after I read it, I was like, oh, I'm just gonna steal everything. I'm just gonna mimic all of this in my own work. And so he's gonna be so happy to hear that you even picked up All American Boys. He's probably on here losing his mind right now.
I loved it.
So a question from Bookmarks Festival. Any advice for librarians and teachers who are dealing with attempted book bans in their schools? Jason, a few of your books have been banned. You want to talk about any advice you have?
I've made it a point at this point to not really. It's tricky for me right now because I don't really, we give so much energy to the people who hate us, and I'd rather just give my energy to those librarians and say, like, I don't have any advice, but I want you to know I'm grateful for you, and I'm thankful for your support and for what you're doing on the front lines. And I'd rather just pour my energy there. I don't know if I have advice because I'm careful about giving advice without context, and I'm not in your communities, I'm not in your schools, and I would never offer you something that might put your jobs on the line. But if you need something from me, and if you need, if there's anything that I can do to be supportive of you without us having to sort of give all this energy to naysayers, right? I'd rather just give all my energy to you than reach out and we can figure something out. But I don't, I'm just not interested in sort of talking about how much I can't stand banning. And it's like, all right, we know that. I'd rather just say, good on all the people who are fighting the good fight. And let's do everything we can to support those people.
John?
Yeah, amen to that. I agree that those people and deserve our support. To my knowledge, the Cider House Rules, which was on a list of proposed books to ban in Texas, a piece of proposed Republican legislation that covered books on the abortion subject, but also books, as we know. So there's been so much banning of books, not only on the abortion subject, at a time when those states that are banning those books have also closed down on abortion access. Now, what message of cruelty is that sending to young women who are facing an unwanted pregnancy? And more severe and more widespread is the banning of books on about the LGBTQ subject in schools and libraries. To what end? To purposely make gay, lesbian, and trans kids feel more isolated and alone than they already feel. Mm-hmm. The cruelty of that is abhorrent, and it's willful. So all we can do is protest it and support the people who feel it most. But the effect this is having, the banning of books, it's the young people who are getting hurt.
Yep.
Because people who are facing issues of their own, they need to find in literature examples that tell them you're not alone. See this? You're not alone.
Thank you for saying that, John. So the last question is from the Savannah Book Festival. And this writer says, A Prayer for Owen Meany has been one of my favorite books since I read it as a teenager. I reread it the past summer and agree with you about the importance of the first sentence in a novel. The first sentence is definitely the one that makes me want to keep reading. What is your favorite first sentence from another author? Jason, you first, and then John.
It's definitely the first sentence of A Prayer for Owen Meany. Definitely. It's definitely, it has to be one of the greatest. To me, and it's funny because Brendan, that's why he gave me the book. He's like, because I'm a big first sentence guy. Like, that's my jam, and he's like, this is the best first sentence ever written. And he gave me the book. And and I'm not saying this to be because we're on this thing. I want to be honest with you, Mr. Irving. It very well might be the greatest first sentence ever written. At least it's on my list. That's for sure.
John, for those who don't know the first sentence, can you do it for us? From memory, or is it?
No, it's a long sentence to remember. I usually, when I'm asked, simply begin with, "I'm doomed to remember a boy with a wrecked voice." In a way to say more, I think, spoils the experience. It's a very long first sentence, but it certainly is the best of my first sentences. I've not found a better one or a more inclusive one. Why, of course, is because before you begin the story, I'm doomed to remember a boy with a wrecked voice. You already know the worst thing. He's gone. Mm-hmm. And you're going to hear why. You're going to hear how. So it's a real let the cat out of the bag first sentence. My own favorite first sentence has everything or all to do with Moby Dick having the best ending, or the best foreshadowed ending, in my opinion, ever written. And it's because of how much I admire the foreshadowing of the ending of that novel, that the first sentence, which is very plain and simple, gives me goosebumps every time. Call me Ishmael. Well, as you'll discover, he's got a lot more to say than that. but it's a good thing that it's a great idea to start there, because he's the only one who's going to make it. And you kind of know he has to make it, or there wouldn't be anybody alive to tell the story.
Exactly.
Well, John and Jason, thank you so much for doing this. I have been seeing some of these comments scroll across my screen here, and I hope you get a chance to read all of the incredible things people have been saying about both of you. I mean, there are people here who, I think, got married because they read your books, and, it's amazing how much they love you both. Jason Reynolds, this is his most recent novel, Stunt Boy. In the meantime, I recommend you all read it. John Irving, on Tuesday, his first novel in 7 years, The Last Chairlift. It will be out. If you want to know what I think about it, you can go to YouTube and you can look up The Word According to Karp. It is a video series I have, and it was inspired by you-know-who, and I talk all about how great the Last Chairlift is, and it also goes into the story of this cover, which there's a big story behind it. Thank you all so much for coming. It's been a pleasure. Have a really, really good evening.
Thank you.
Great to meet you, Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Irving. I appreciate you.